Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mark Blythe, and this is my basement because in times of COVID and you're doing homeschooling, you've got to find a quiet place you can transmit from. Welcome to the Rhodes Center seminar series. It is a great pleasure today to bring Dr. Pavlina Tcherneva to talk to us today about her book, The Case for a Job Guarantee. Some background on this before we start. One of the things that I was constantly getting requests to talk about in our speaker series and on our podcast series is, of course, the exciting set of ideas that's very much out there in the world called modern monetary theory. And Professor Tcherneva is part of the group of scholars that's generating those ideas. But where she fits into this is less on the kind of monetary side and the monetary plumbing and the stuff to do with consolidated balance sheets and why deficit spending is not the terror that we think it is, and more on, if you will, the kind of real world component part of this, which is the job guarantee, which is both a counter-cyclical macroeconomic stabilizer and just a damn good thing to do. And that's basically the case that she makes for us in her book, which I've got here, The Case for a Job Guarantee, which was selected by Martin Wolf of the Financial Times as one of the best books of 2020, calling it an argument that you may disagree with, but one you absolutely have to engage with. So Professor Tcherneva is an associate professor and director of the economics program at Bard College and a research associate at the Levy Economics Institute, and is also an expert at the Institute for New Economic Thinking. And with that introduction and setup, I will now pass on to Professor Tcherneva to tell us about the case for a job guarantee. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Mark, for having me. Thank you, everyone. Economists don't talk a lot about the right to employment, but I want to start off that way and walk us a little bit through the journey in the United States of why the right to employment has been so difficult to secure. And then I'd like to make the case that there's a good economic case to be made for securing the right to employment through a job guarantee, through a policy proposal that is, well, simply better than what we currently have. So I have some slides here I'm going to share. And, okay, all right. So securing the right to employment, how can we connect human rights to economic policy? The first mention of the right to employment, I believe, is in the French Constitution of 1793. That recurring demand, has kind of waned and reappeared and waned again. But in the United States, it was really during the Great Depression that we picked up that conversation of securing the right to employment. There is, of course, formal international recognition, both in the UN Charter, but later on formalized. What does it mean to have economic rights? Was formalized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then, of course, there are a variety of treaties, international treaties. Any national constitution that has been inspired by the UN Declaration, or even prior, as I just mentioned, that has been drafted even before these international attempts. There are many countries that have the right to employment in those constitutions, and that mandate is still unmet, as well as the ILO has multiple documents. The most recent one in 2019, where they produce a report on the future of work and again situate this broader agenda, policy agenda around the right to employment. Of course, the job guarantee was also a signature policy during the civil rights era. And now it was singled out in the Green New Deal resolution, as well as it is part of the modern calls to democratize work in all of its forms. So let's talk a little bit about the journey in the United States. So the first attempt to translate the right to paid remunerative employment happens during the New Deal. There is an articulation of that in the report on the Committee on Economic Security that is drafted by Harry Hopkins and Francis Perkins, among others. in the FDR administration. And the idea there is quite clear that there is a need to provide employment relief, and that must be done through direct employment, direct action by the government. The Civil Works Administration at the time was very successful, and but it was short-lived. In the 1934-35, the CWA employed many unemployed men, and it was so popular that at the time, people regarded that as something that government owed them. Of course, there were conservative interests, racist Southern employers, farmers who depended on cheap migrant labor. They kind of opposed these policies. And at that time, FDR was reasonably conservative. And he was convinced by his conservative budget director to cancel the CWA because they believed that if they had renewed it, they will not be able to get rid of it. And so they didn't renew it. So that was our first attempt. But FDR eventually kind of articulates this aspirational goal that we need, just like we're securing civil rights, we also have to secure economic rights. And you have seen them, but he leads with the right to a job. And there have been some steps made to secure the rest of the economic rights that he outlines, with the exception of medical care in the United States. But the right to a job still hangs there. And economists have a fair amount of responsibility for why that is the case. There's another attempt to secure the right to work. And in those days, it was called the right to work. Today, it has different meaning. But in the Full Employment Bill of 1945, you will see that explicit language that the right to work must be guaranteed. It's the responsibility of the government. That is contested once again by conservative interests. The ambush comes in the form of the Employment Act of 1946, where that is removed. The language of the right to work is removed. And now the goal becomes a little more amorphous. Now we're talking about maximum employment, whatever that may mean, and an explicit emphasis also on price stability, that it is the job of the public sector to achieve maximum employment price stability in cooperation with private enterprise. And so what we've got is really kind of a articulation of what at that time you might call a Keynesian policy that would look like, a significant government stimulus to the economy, but through, stimulating the activity of private enterprise to achieve full employment and maximum employment and price stability. There is a general dissatisfaction with this mandate that comes in the 70s. Because, as you know, we experienced the great stagflation. We have high inflation, high unemployment, and the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, or the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, once again puts the responsibility back onto the government to secure full employment. But by then, this idea of full employment is quite amorphous. It's quite separate from the idea of the right to employment. And as students of economics know, the full employment is this moving target. It's this definition that it could mean anything. You can see statements, for example, by Bill Vickery, who thought that the last time we had achieved full employment was in 1926, I believe, when we had 1.6% unemployment rate. You can see, statements by Harry Hopkins, who is also talking about 2% or less than 2%. I have found statements in Keynes's work, less than 1% unemployment is full employment. But in the Full Employment and Balanced Growth Act, we actually have explicit numeric targets, 3 to 4%. And so here we are. We had 3 or 4% prior to the pandemic. And no one, I think, would argue that that was full employment. And in fact, we had conversations at the policy level that there is plenty of labor market slack. So what we have is a conversation that takes place in economic theory that is redefining what it means to have full employment, and it no longer means the right to everyone who wants a job to have it, but is now associated with some level of positive unemployment. Now, all of this becomes a bit more complicated because in the 50s and the 60s, we formalize the trade-off between unemployment and inflation in the familiar Phillips curve and the so-called NIRO. That's the canon of economic theory. And so long as we have a policy objective where governments are charged with securing maximum employment and price stability, and there is an assumed trade-off between the two, then we have to choose. The policymaker is given an impossible choice, essentially. Now, this trade-off is what I want to argue is something we need to give up. There isn't strong evidence for this trade-off. And indeed, there is an alternative. There is a way to stabilize economies without tolerating unemployment in the name of price stability. And that's the function of the Job Guarantee proposal, or at least one of the functions. So the problem that, as I see it, is that NIRO has become a policy guide to the extent that monetary policy is charged with the macro management of the economy. There is an implicit notion, an idea that we need to search for the optimal level of unemployment so that we know when to stop providing whatever stimulus the Fed thinks it is providing. So here's a quote from Jay Powell from 2019. And we need the concept of the natural rate of unemployment, and we need to have some sense of whether unemployment is high, low, or just right. And so I think that this is, I think, a problem, a serious problem from the point of view both of economic theory, of economic policy, but also from the point of view of human rights. What is the just right level of unemployment and poverty? Now, in fairness, credit where credit is due, Jay Powell then, on the testimony argued, look, the relationship between the slack in the economy, unemployment, and inflation has gone away. So we cannot find the NIRO. But he still kind of insists on this relationship. At the end of the day, there has to be some connection. So even if we cannot find it empirically, there has to be some connection between those two, because if we push unemployment too low, wages, God forbid, might start rising. And that is, we need to ward off against those wage increases, because that can fuel inflation. And we have a better way of doing this. We have a better way of controlling inflation than actually keeping unemployment. Okay, so we don't want to be insisting on the necessity for policy purposes. So and then we have an inflation conundrum at the policy level as well. Tarullo had said in 2017 that the Fed has no reliable theory of inflation. Janet Yellen herself had argued that the dynamics between inflation and unemployment may be misspecified in some fundamental way. So if we have no theory of inflation and no theory of the NIRO, then what do we do next? But you will find, nevertheless, the NIRO in every macroeconomic model, and it needs to go. Now, this is what it looks like. The unemployment rate for the United States, very volatile. I like to call it the human yo-yo, as with every recession, en masse people are, lose their jobs. Recoveries have become more protracted, slower. There are all sorts of catch-22s that the unemployed face. I enumerate them in the book, especially people at the lower end. Low-wage workers have the hardest time re-entering the labor market. Long-term unemployed have the hardest time securing employment. There are certain demographic groups that have barriers to employment. And so when we are asking the question of what is the optimal level of unemployment, I think in the same breath, we're asking the question of who should be unemployed. When we're defining full employment as 3 or 4% unemployment, we're implicitly saying that, there will be some folks who will be scrambling, they will be looking, they will be the most vulnerable, but that's okay, because it generates price stability. Okay, so I also use this metaphor as unemployment as a silent epidemic. This was way before the pandemic. I had written a paper enumerating some of the social costs of unemployment. But the basic premise here is that if we observe how unemployment behaves, first of all, it's chronic. Even in the best of times, there is involuntary unemployment. But also when you look at it spatially, how it propagates, it quite literally acts as an infectious agent. If there is a community that experiences mass layoffs, those ripple through the community, and more folks lose their jobs because of the mass layoffs that have occurred and the decline in purchasing spending power. So if you just watch how unemployment spreads, it's truly a viral phenomena. But then it is viral in the sense that it has these impacts on the unemployed and on their families. So it is quite literally deadly. This is not a hyperbole. We have data on the increase in mortality, a permanent increase in mortality, a high correlation between unemployment and suicides. We know that it is costly in terms of the enormous social costs, not just the scarring effects that you typically hear about, the loss of wages and income, but health costs. Mental, physical health costs, outcomes for spouses, for children, communities, foregone output, you name it. It's just that at the macro level, we don't incorporate all of those costs. And I think that if you were to do that, a case can be made that they dwarf the costs of simply providing a job to somebody who needs one. Okay, so I distinguish in the book between real costs and financial costs. The real cost, the foregone real output, and the real destitution that comes with unemployment is what matters. It's not the financial costs. The financial costs are already baked in. They are costs we cannot avoid because governments are ultimately responsible for dealing with the fallout of poverty and unemployment. And of course, many other socioeconomic problems are connected to the problem of unemployment. So these are costs that will be there and are incurred anyway. And there's just a better way of addressing that problem. So if you take the idea that unemployment behaves as a silent epidemic, then how do we deal, or at least how are we supposed to deal with them if we were functioning, if we had a functioning government, and hopefully we'll do better, but prevention, right? And preparedness. This is how we deal with pandemics or epidemics. Two things we did not have. But if that is the way to think about economic problems, then we act not when it is too late and when the crisis is upon us and when unemployment has shot through the roof, but indeed we put in place infrastructure and policy responses to deal with it on an ongoing basis in preparedness. And providing employment to the unemployed on demand would be one such preparedness response. So we do come to the job guarantee, but I want to situate a little bit the job guarantee in the conversation that is taking place today. Okay, so Keynesianism back in vogue. It seems a whole lot of support. There's a lot of support out there for bold, big government action, bold expenditures. We may have shed our phobia of debts and deficits, which is a very welcome thing. How much this will stick, we will see. But running it hot is what we will hear a lot, and we're already hearing. Let's run the economy hot. Let's run labor markets hot. And there's a certain sense in which hot labor, a hot economy does create a lot more employment opportunities. But we know what the structure of this economy does. It creates inequality, growth brings inequality, and that has been the case for the last 50 years. So running it hot really is a question of, who's getting the contract, where's the funding going, what kind of activities are we supporting, whose incomes. We also know that there are environmental effects. So running it hot just by heating private economic activity is not necessarily what we want in terms of its environmental impact, financial instability. Involuntary unemployment stays with us. However hot you're going to run the economy, as I said, firms don't like to hire the unemployed. And those who have been out of the job market for the longest period of time will have the hardest time. But also, firms are not in the business of hiring everyone who wants a job. That is the job of the federal government. So again, we come back to the question, full employment jobs for whom? There's a very interesting and kind of important dialogue on automatic stabilizers. This is all very welcome, like strengthening unemployment insurance, nutrition assistance, and the whole list. Conspicuously absent here is the right to a job or jobs program. Okay, so what I call these either benevolent or not so benevolent unemployment regimes. However well-meaning public policy may be, if it lacks the guarantee that if a person walks into the unemployment office or is looking for a job and cannot find it, no matter how benevolent policy is, if it doesn't have an employment guarantee, it will remain an unemployment regime, a costly unemployment regime. There's a whole other conversation of what Keynes meant by fiscal policy for full employment. I won't engage in that. I have a paper on it, but I think Keynesianism is in quotation for that reason, that it's not quite what Keynes would have prescribed. Okay. All right, what is the job guarantee? Job guarantee plus, well, the job guarantee is a public option. It's a public option for jobs. And as I stated, there are really two choices. We either guarantee unemployment or we pay for unemployment, the paradigm within which we live, or we redirect our resources and we pay for employment, we guarantee employment. So it is a policy that aims to legally enforce the right to employment. It's not an obligation to employment, so not to be confused with workfare, but it is it guarantees jobs to those who need them. It's not just another jobs program, it's a structural reform, it's a narrow alternative. I'll talk briefly about that. It's a superior economic stabilizer, and it's an automatic macroeconomic stabilizer and a labor standard. Now, okay, it's a plus because it is one of the two legs of, if you will, Harry Hopkins's economic security agenda. An economic security agenda had in the New Dealers' minds two goals. One was direct and guaranteed employment, and the other one was income support of various kinds for people who cannot work. And that income support took the form of Social Security, unemployment insurance, child support, housing, the whole, what became to be known as the welfare safety net. Okay, but the first leg was missing, right? The guaranteed employment. Okay, so what is it? Well, when we say a guarantee, it just means when you go into the employment office, you're going to walk out with a job. It doesn't mean that you're guaranteed a job for life, irrespective of what you do. I think this is a bit of a confusion out there. It's a public option for jobs. It's a safety net for all the reasons that we described. There are some people who are especially vulnerable in the labor market. They need decent, stable employment opportunities. There are others who have been outside of the labor force for a very long time, and they have trouble transitioning. We know caregivers experience this problem. If you are an unemployed parent, your chances of getting a job are higher than if you are a parent who has been out of the labor force for many years, taking care of children. So a transitional employment opportunity is necessary. The same for young people who are graduating in the middle of a recession. Okay, it is a permanent program, not one you put in place just in the depths of a recession, but it's there even in the best of times because, as we know, unemployment exists. And if we put in place that infrastructure, that means that the amplitudes of mass layoffs are not so severe. Right? We know that countries that have attempted to secure very low level of unemployment rates, you could call them full employment regimes. You can think of the corporatist model the Nordic countries, or even Japan, they don't see unemployment yo-yo like that, as it does in countries in the Western world, where we just tolerate mass unemployment. There's a lot more stable labor market. Okay, so it is a permanent program, and in that sense, it's an automatic stabilizer, because as the economy contracts and folks lose their employment opportunity, they have another choice. They're able to pick up a different employment opportunity. And so it really supplements the behavior of the private sector. So whatever changes occur in the private sector, they're going to be offset by public sector employment. There is a little bit of a confusion of whether this is actually going to work as well as we say it will. And as I say, it's very important to recognize that full employment regimes are more stable regimes. Full employment economies are more stable economies. Private sector employment is more stable when there is a more stable purchasing power, demand, and security all around. So we should not anticipate enormous amplitudes or enormous shifts and changes in the public program. But as we will get to in a moment, there is plenty of work around to do. And so I don't think that we're going to run out of jobs or projects that can be accomplished under this program. It's a bottom-up fiscal policy. And this, I think, is another important macroeconomic feature, because it really provides the employment opportunities where they're needed. In the current behavior of the labor market, employment opportunities always improve for the high-skilled, high-wage employed people who almost never really experience prolonged unemployment. It is those positive, virtuous cycles that happen at the top. So, you throw in contracts at firms, you're going to improve the employment conditions of people who are already doing fairly well. What you want to do is target your employment strategies to those who have greatest obstacles. Okay, it's a structural reform, as I said, because it's a stabilization tool. It's a federally funded program because the public sector is the one responsible, right? The public sector is the only one that can function anti-cyclically, and it is responsible for macroeconomic stabilization. It is responsible for the costs of unemployment, the social costs of unemployment, and only the public sector can choke off the demand for jobs. The private sector, as I said, is not able to provide employment for all. Okay, it's universal access, and it's voluntary employment on demand, open to all folks who need it. It's a labor standard in the following sense, that if that public option provides $15 an hour plus basic benefits, that becomes the standard for the economy. That is the needed competition for the private sector to match the terms of the public job offer. Okay, very quickly, let me skip through here. What it's not, I want to emphasize, it's not compulsory workfare, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, but nobody is forced or nobody is losing their existing benefits unless and until they show up for work. So it's not that. Okay, it's not a handout, it's not temporary, it's not 100% employment. As I said, it's one of the two legs of an economic security strategy and not just another infrastructure program. Forerunners, there hasn't been really a universal job guarantee program around the world. There is a very large one that exists in India. It is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, very interesting case study. It employs about 30% of households. And in the pandemic, it has been the only lifeline for those families. It's enormous, it's very large. And as you know, poverty is a serious problem in India. It's very interestingly and democratically run and organized through local village forums. There are many programs. There are in the Western world. They run in a different way. There are 0 long-term unemployment areas in France that were just, the parliament just voted its expansion of this program, very successful. There has been expanded public works program in South Africa. The Plan IHEFAS that I have studied closely in Argentina. A couple of different programs in Austria, Future Jobs Fund in the UK. In the late 70s, we had one for youth, also very successful. There are many. There are many, large or small. They're forerunners because they are inspired by this idea that, we got to secure the right to employment. And we do it in voluntary, participatory ways. So they offer some interesting insights on implementation. We had modeled the job guarantee at the Levy Economics Institute with my colleagues before, again, the pandemic. At the time, we wanted a very ambitious, large program that would employ 15 million people, which I think would be quite adequate today as well. We may need to employ more. But what we modeled is 15 million people at $15 an hour plus benefits, including childcare. And what we found is that it permanently increased the real GDP by $500 to $600 billion. Permanently increased private sector employment. There's a positive employment effect in the private sector, $3 to $4 million. Insignificant impact on inflation, negligible, in fact, that was in its peak. And permanent reduction in welfare costs, invisible, we didn't actually even model all of the savings of those expenditures, significant improvement in state budgets, and at a cost of 1 to 1.5% of GDP. Okay, very quickly, the Green New Deal has the job guarantee. It was called perhaps the single most crucial aspect of the Green New Deal. I think that reasonably we can identify 3 job guarantees in the Green New Deal resolution. The first one is that all hands on deck policy that we're talking about, the bold infrastructure investment that needs to take place with all manner of investment and technology, etc. Now, it also has a job guarantee, employment guarantee with comparable income to those who have toiled in the fossil fuel industries, or early retirement. And there's a safety net also for the most vulnerable, who are promised and guaranteed employment in the green transition, which I think is key in that discourse, because that was always a stumbling block. The fossil fuel companies often hold towns hostage to any transition policies because for fear of losing the little employment that they have. But the third job guarantee here is the employment stabilizer. I think that this is really important. It's not, the cleaning up the planet is not going to be a complete project. Maintenance will need to be done even after we have accomplished our most urgent needs. But so long as the market and the economy has a heartbeat, and so long as it goes through its cycles, we will still need an employment stabilizer, even in a clean world, in a green world. And so I think this is one useful way of thinking about the job guarantee as it's found in the Green New Deal discourse. But now we have Build Back Better, and now we have an articulation of an establishment of a civilian climate corps by the Biden administration. We don't have any details, so we don't know what that would look like and what the scale of that would be, but it is for the remediation of public lands, about 30% until 2035, I believe, or 2030. You can look up the details. But how could we do this? How can we use the civilian climate corps and maybe use that as a vehicle for putting in place a job guarantee? The job guarantee, I often say, it has always been green. From the early days of Roosevelt days, from the Tree Army, those were very successful programs. Early fire prevention methods, all of the natural parks, the trails, all of the environmental work that was done then. But it is also important because it's not work for commercial return, and it is always under provisioned. And so a permanent civilian climate jobs corps, I think is a good idea. So how could we potentially do it? Well, during the New Deal, there was a New Deal office in every county. So let's do the same thing again. Open a permanent CCC office in every county across the United States. supply CCC projects and job lists to the American Job Centers. These are our unemployment offices, right? They're now called American Job Centers. There are multiple models of doing this. Some of them can be top down. They can be federal projects with specific guidelines. Some of them can and should be bottom up. There are many communities that have already community groups that try to deal with social economic problems on the ground. They already have some capacities, infrastructure. We should mobilize those and have them participate in the process of proposing the local projects. So it could be a hybrid model for developing these job lists and creating these jobs banks, if you will. Create a national online jobs portal, invite local community groups, pay at least $15 an hour. This would be, this would hasten the fight for 15. Health, if we pay health, that would be another way of universalizing healthcare in the United States. Paid leave is another missing policy from our welfare package. We propose childcare. I think it's a good idea that also comes with a childcare, and I understand that this might be a bit too ambitious for some folks, but I think we should hire everyone who shows up. I think that's basically the criteria. Is there really a good reason if somebody comes and looks for work that we cannot find something of social environmental value for them to do? I think we need to be a lot more creative about thinking about what a job is, what we need and can do, how we can put our human capacities to work. All right, I'm going to close out just with this. The Green New Deal components were polled recently. The Job Guarantee seems to enjoy the greatest support of all the components, but it's a popular proposition. There were a number of polls back in 2018, such as Data for Progress. The most recent one was done by the Harris-Hill survey, which showed overwhelming bipartisan support. And this is what I wanted to conclude with, that jobs are not really, of course, there was plenty of political wrangling at the policy level, and plenty of conservative governors even who refused to take some of the funding that FDR provided. I think we should have no illusion that this will not be a similar fight. But when the jobs were put in place, they were extremely popular, and I expect them to be so again. And so it's just a matter of making that a reality, with which I'm going to end, and I'm going to say thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful stuff. Great, we're here. We've got the questions coming in through the Q&A. So if you're on the Zoom chat around Brown and you're in that way, you can put your question in the Q&A. We're going to work through those. And if you're watching on YouTube Live, you can put a question in the comments, and we've got someone who's going to pick it up from there and relay it into the chat. We've got about 20 minutes left, which is great. So I'm not going to abuse my privilege as chair. I'm going to go straight to the questions that are coming in. And so I'm going to start off with David Weil, who is an economist, is a macroeconomist here at Brown. And he's got the following question. I'm confused about the relationship between the idea that jobs are a right on the one hand and the idea that dinero is incorrect on the other. Is there a logical dependence between these? Many neoclassical economists like me would say that surely the dinero relationship is not what we previously understood, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. This is a positive issue about which people can have disagreements. But is the question of whether jobs are a right dependent on the answer to that positive question? That cuts right to the heart of it. Essentially, yeah, it's a key question. Are we doing this because it's functionally good, because we can exploit a kink in our understanding, or are we doing it because it's a rights claim, which actually does seem to be fundamentally different? How do you feel about that?
Yes, no, I appreciate that. I think that there are two conversations. One is the philosophical conversation of what is the right. Is it a categorical right? Mm-hmm. I mean, why does it appear in 1793 first? Why didn't we talk about the right to employment beforehand? And it has something to do, I think, with the evolution of a market economy, with capitalism, with, wage labor, the increasing reliance on commodification of labor, et cetera. I think that the fact that is our ticket for subsistence, is wage work, the predominant, I think, is connected. So it is maybe not, a categorical right in the Kantian sense that, some things are just right and some things are just wrong, but maybe in the context of what is a good life in a market economy, it is a right because it is one of the key and perhaps some of the most critical ways in which we self-determine is through paid employment. So maybe in that context, it is sort of a philosophical claim. I think what I'm saying about the NAIRO is that it has been extremely effective in diverting the conversation away from some of these moral claims. And we, as economists, I think we should engage with some of these moral claims and not simply argue on supposed technocratic reasons that, it's all well and good, it's lovely to do that, but we just can't do it because there is a trade-off. And so I think that the NAIRO relationship, whatever the empirical challenges are, I think that it is sensible to say that with the current methods of stabilization, we can observe inflationary pressures before we see zero unemployment, let's say, right? So that there are some periods where there's a little bit more of a trade-off, but I am unconvinced that it's been strong demand that has generated the inflationary episodes that we have seen. But let me grant you this, that there might be a trade-off. If we are trying to stimulate the economy, and if the economy tends to divert funding to hot sectors, successful sectors, winner industries, those who are operating at capacity, who might be having trouble securing some employment, you might see that would happen. This, I think, is preempted actually in Keynes's chapter 20 of the general theory, where he talks about the employment function and says, if you want to increase employment by generalized demand, some of it is going to go towards prices and profits, which is a separate kind of economic argument. And I'm saying that, well, how about we do it another way? How about we go from the bottom and do stabilization that way, and then find the source of inflation independent of removing income from the economy, right? And so what we're seeing in terms of inflation today is mostly bottlenecks in housing and Medicare and education. So it's not really demand pull inflation. We're not even seeing inflation now all that much, but whatever price increases people are observing are structural issues. And so those can be dealt with structural measures. I don't think unemployment is the answer. Keynes also had a proposal for deferred payments. And you can potentially, if there is a demand pull inflation, you could do that, but it's not unemployment that's the answer. So what I'm saying is that the NAIRO is just a very convenient excuse to maintain unemployment.
All right, great. Thank you. We'll move on from there. So two questions, one from Tony Levidas and another from Andrew Shank, are both related. Tony says, my sense is that demand for full employment have been displaced by demands for UBI, and that to one degree or another, MMT is associated with this displacement. How does this debate play out in the reaction to your work? Or more bluntly, why, if there is an employment crisis, if there is chronic unemployment that leads to poverty, et cetera, why should we prefer jobs and the provision of jobs over UBI?
Well, because people they want jobs. People want jobs. I get it that the UBI community has gotten some fair amount of attention, but I don't think necessarily it has displaced the demand for jobs has been displaced by UBI. When you poll, you poll, and there have been YouGov polls even before the ones I mentioned. UBI does not poll as well as jobs. And then even if, we say, okay, let's just do some sort of income support. And, as I said, the second leg of economic security is some sort of income support. But even when we do that, we find that income support policies don't create the missing jobs. That will be a perennial problem. And so I think that, it's an entirely separate question of, it's not really about preference. I personally, don't like UBI policies, but UBI policies don't solve the problem of unemployment.
So two related questions then about the operation of the program. So Nicholas Abogue asked the following question. How do you fire people? Will they be fired? How does that work when you have a guarantee? Because termination has to be some part of an employment contract. And Andrew says, do you worry that unemployed people who don't show up will be further vilified by the political right, with attendant consequences for the rest of the already beleaguered social safety net?
Yeah, I get these questions often, and I'm trying to figure out whether the guarantee is really confusing people, because it's a job like any other. You cannot get paid if you don't show up for work, right? It's just a job. The guarantee is that when you show up at the unemployment office, there will be an employment opportunity. And that doesn't negate all the other kind of, social ways in which we structure our workplace and we, create a productive environment. It actually is a little one better than the way we do it in the private sector, because, the private sector works on commercial return. And so there are very concrete criteria, profit criteria for firing and hiring. Here, we're actually producing social returns. So, did we plant the trees? Did we clean up the, landfill? There are different kinds of objectives. So, in that sense, you're not being laid off because it wasn't profitable. But if you are abusive and neglectful or whatever to the environment, you don't retain the job. The example I use is the following. Okay, you can go into a public library, right? Like, everybody has the right to walk into a public library and access the resources. Now, if you walk in and you abuse staff, you will be walked out, right? Are you going to be prevented from coming back in next time? No, you're not going to be prevented. If you can use a book the second time, right? And that's the same idea. So it's not a guarantee to sleep on the job and be paid.
Jessica Burbank has a question. She works with a firm that basically tries to influence political opinion on these types of issues. And she says, what do you think the major challenges when it comes to convincing the average voter in the US that the jobs guarantee is possible in the US? What are the dominant views or perhaps delusions that are the main barriers to people thinking that this is actually just possible in a country like the US?
I think that part of the problem is our discourse about government, right? The role of the government in the public sector. And so, we've lived for 40, 50 years of, assault on the public sector, which has resulted in reduced capacities. The institutions have lost their funding, their staff, etc. So I think that there are legitimate concerns there. However, I really don't think that they're insurmountable. We see poorer countries do massive, successful jobs programs. We certainly can, and we have had the experience. I think part of it is discourse. Should this be the responsibility of the government, the public sector? We are moving away from some of these old frames. I think that's a good thing. The second thing is, maybe it's a little bit about marketing. I insist on the guarantee because it drives the point across that whoever you are, whatever your personal circumstance is, and whatever the state of the economy is, if you would like to work, I can't find a good economic reason or moral reason why we cannot secure that employment opportunity. Now, if a civilian or climate conservation corps is the way to push it forward, absolutely. We need green jobs. Those are the job guarantee jobs, care jobs as well. What I would just urge policymakers to think about is that these are not one-off crisis solutions, that we do need an ongoing support for the unemployed and basically, enhance the safety net. And, I understand that these are challenging tasks, but if we were to secure jobs, I think that they will create the constituency and the support, much like with Social Security.
So that's the constituency amongst voters. Jason Rice asked something which we're going to talk about more when we do the podcast shortly, is the following. What are the challenges and pushback you can expect from the private sector to a jobs guarantee? As he says, aside from their interest in disciplining labour. I'd phrase that slightly differently. I mean, one of the shocking statistics that we can all trot out is that the majority of American workers earn up to or less than $20 an hour, which in a country this rich is quite astonishing. So there has been a huge shift in what economists call the labour share over the past 30 years. So if you divide the price level by average blue collar wages, basically you have the cost structures of the 2020s and you've got 1970s wages for large parts of the population. So what the jobs guarantee essentially does, and you didn't say much about this in your presentation, but I want you to say more about it because it's on Jason's point, is you're doing a wage floor. And when you do a wage floor of 15 or perhaps higher, you're basically forcing the firms that pay less than that to either improve their productivity or go out of business. That's basically it, which means that you will be destroying jobs at the same time. Second thing is, if 15 is the minimum, then it's only up from there, which means that the wage share is going to increase and the capital share is going to go down. And historically speaking, capital doesn't like it when the capital share goes down. They tend to get really annoyed and politically mobilized, and hence we had the 1980s. So do you worry that in a sense by doing this, you might be kind of, to use that old Marxist phrase, seeding the seeds of your own destruction in a sense?
All right. So let's maybe talk first about the floor, the wage floor. The job guarantee, no doubt, is not going to be the panacea to the labor market problems. We have a hollowing out in our labor market. So we don't want $15 an hour jobs. We want better jobs, right? And so it's not going to be, the solution necessarily that people are looking for. I mean, part of the things that we're doing with public investment, procurement policy, union jobs, just supporting industry, there's a whole slew of policies that we can put in place in conjunction with the job guarantee. You don't want it to be the lone soldier out there. Will it destroy jobs? Now, the concentration in the private sector is very large. Look what happened to Amazon. Had no trouble after Bernie Sanders shamed Bezos into paying $15 an hour. Did it overnight, right? These companies, they can do it. Now, mom and pop shops, it's a legitimate concern for small communities. Now, but what would a community look like that is having imagine now 10% unemployment, but now all of a sudden you're looking at 2% unemployment. What's going to happen to the local taco truck, to the local restaurant shop? They will be, I think, some issues with folks who cannot pay, but there is also the safety net. There's also the employment safety net, and the economic activity would help the mom and pop shops, I think. Now, the employers who are relying on wage theft, on abusive practices that just don't want to do it, yes, they should go out of business. And I think that, we should take a stand on this. It's easier to do this if we were to do a national minimum wage policy than actually allow the JG to do the heavy lifting. So, all firms then have to match that floor. But the political question on sowing the seeds of your own destruction, I mean, look, the scales have been tipped, if you want to talk about it in those terms, capital and labor. And so we either throw our hands and we say, okay, or we say we need something to rebalance the scales. The left doesn't like sometimes the job guarantee because it's not a really good solution to the problems of capital, right? On the other hand, it is a very democratic solution to a system that we have, right? We do recognize that, we have a safety net, and it was hard fought, right? And so that is just one other piece. So I don't think that this is necessarily an easy battle, but that was the battle we had for, the minimum wage, for child labor, for, guaranteed public services. It's always going to be there.
So we've got a couple of minutes left. Two excellent questions, one off of YouTube and then one again inside here. You mentioned Amazon, so I'm going to go with Nicolo Fracaloli's question first, which is, in the US, market concentration has increased substantially in the last few decades. As a consequence, a small set of private firms is very influential in setting wages, prices, and employment. This poses a political economy problem, as the role of government in creating jobs and reaching full employment is therefore more limited than in the past. Does that impact the ability of the job guarantee to work? And then the last one, I'm just going to throw this in here because it's a very good one. How does David Graeber's theory of, pardon me, bullshit jobs fit into this? Because his critique was, you don't need most of this work done. Let people not do work for the sake of doing work. So how would you take those two things? The issue of concentration, essentially the private sector can crowd out government jobs rather than the other way around. And then basically the quote unquote bullshit jobs problem.
Okay. I don't want to minimize the political economy challenges, but the criteria that the job guarantee has to clear is whether it is better than what we have today. Okay. And so they are not a reason for against the job guarantee or for its ineffectiveness, because it just needs to be marginally more effective than having mass unemployment. Okay. So on the issue of bullshit jobs, Graeber, documents, a lot of examples. And I want to say that pretty much all of his examples are, private sector bullshit jobs, watching over people over their shoulder. Are they doing the right thing? Advertising, pushing paper, etc. Now, the job guarantee is not creating jobs for the sake of, I wouldn't, it certainly is better than unemployment. So yes, you do want to create, they're important in and of themselves because, going back to the UBI questions, the cost of unemployment, the majority are non-monetary. And when you survey people why they want jobs, income is not at the top of the list. Okay. And so, it's for the sake of, we want to be very careful what we're saying. We're not painting rocks. I know that David Graeber, we had a little exchange with him and he's like, oh, we're not going to be, we don't want people to be painting rocks. I don't want people to be painting rocks, obviously. What's the public use of that? But can we really think of exhausted environmental work? We have real challenges. You drive through the Midwest, it's flooded on an ongoing basis. We've got fires that, anyway, there are just so many of these. And I think that we just need to be a little more creative in what a job is and start improving our lives through those public services. Now, the job guarantee is absolutely and perfectly consistent with the reduced working hour. And it's something I discuss in my book, that during the Francis Perkins days, the 30-hour working week was the popular, narrowly defeated proposal. So it's long overdue. And if the JG is a labor standard for full employment of 30 hours, then that is a structural way in which we move forward with those policies throughout the economy.
That's great, and perfect timing for finishing on the hour. Thank you very much for a great presentation and perhaps an even better discussion. We're going to record a podcast shortly, and that will be up on our website and available at Apple and all the usual places afterwards if you want to follow this in a little bit more depth as to what we get into next. I want to thank everyone for being on the Zoom with us today on the presentation, but most of all to thank Pavlina for giving us the talk about her book and sharing these ideas with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.